One of the most important aspects of your argument is how you find and use evidence and how you establish that to support the content of your argument. So that's what we'll be talking about here today. Earlier in another video, I talked about the explosion of Dirty Harry. It was a bomb that went off early 60s. It was a test that happened in Mercury, Nevada, about 113 miles to the southwest of St. George, Utah. It produced an enormous cloud of radioactive dust, and that dust spread over as it migrated north to the northeast. The first place it hit, the first populated place it hit, was St. George. And during that time, there was an enormous escalation in different types of cancer, as well as other indications of radioactive poisoning. Sheep, cattle were dying. They were losing their pelts, their fur. Milk was contaminated. All kinds of things were going on. Not the least of which was an outbreak of certain types of cancer, like thyroid cancer and breast cancer and skin cancer. Other types of pathologies, pediatric onset leukemias, were all the rage at the time of what was going on. And the people got together and said, well, correlating this to what happened in terms of the above ground nuclear testing, that has to be the source. It has to be what caused us to get sick. And so they got together and they formed a class action lawsuit that went to the Utah Supreme Court. And the judge, whom I interviewed personally on this, founded for the plaintiffs of the class action suit and allowed them to sue the United States federal government. The United States government came back and said, well, you can't sue us because we were acting in the behalf and the better good of the citizens of the United States. And while a few people were affected by this, you can't charge us for negligence because we were trying to act for the greater good of everybody else, which is a bunch of crap, really. But another factor came along, and that was that no direct correlation has been made between the different types of cancer and radioactive fallout. Despite some incredible efforts, some Herculean efforts out there to make those correlations, by people who grew up, who went through the time of the downwinders, who had families who themselves suffered from different cancers, different effects, went on to get their PhDs, did enormous amounts of research to make that correlation, and it never stuck. The evidence just didn't hold it up. So we decided to create a documentary about this, we meaning my film students and I, back in 2001. One student did a lot of research dealing with the idea of this pediatric onset leukemia. It's a disease, the pathology of which breaks out in clusters. Okay, a dozen kids or so at a time would come down with this, and she found out about a cluster that had broken out in a place called Fallon, Nevada, where a bunch of kids came down at the same time with pediatric onset leukemia. And this is not a curable disease. It's fatal and it's quick as well. So she decided to cross-reference other breakouts, and at the time, another one came on to her internet radar, and it was down in Arizona. And then the third one popped up as well within about as many weeks in Massachusetts. And so she decided to go through and see what was common between Nevada and Arizona and Massachusetts to see why these kids were suffering so. And what they found out in their blood pathogens was a concentration of the heavy metal of mercury, the substance of arsenic, and the heavy metal of tungsten. So she went on to do further study to find out what were these things really used for. And she discovered that mercury, tungsten, and arsenic are used to mine silver. And based on that evidence, she found that there were indeed silver mines in Fallon, Nevada, in Arizona, and in Massachusetts. And there were not one, but two silver mines in St. George. One is to the northeast of St. George at Silver Reef. There was an active silver mine there right up until the early 1980s. It started in the 1940s. And they were using mercury and tungsten to go through and leach silver out of the mountain, and then they evaporated that into the atmosphere, but it went into the groundwater. Silver Reef happens to be at one of the two major aquifers that feeds water down into the St. George area. The other silver mine was also based at Brookside on the northwestern side of Pine Valley Mountain, which also happens to sit just above the main aquifer, the other main aquifer for St. George. So this evidence, and we're still trying to make these conclusions because it takes a budget, money, scientists to come through and make these correlations, but certainly is pointing in the direction that we couldn't see the forest for the trees. Here we thought these individuals were dying because of the above ground testing and the nuclear radiation, but instead to find out perhaps that they were dying from heavy metals in the groundwater. And the company doing the silver mining in Silver Reef, they're based out of Hurricane. They no longer exist. Who are we going to sue? Who are we going to find to go through and compensate these people who've lost their lives, who've lost their loved ones that way? Well, there are two different schools of evidence here. One is an evidence of fact, and the other one is an evidence of opinion. And these words are going to get a little screwy here in a minute. Evidence of fact, though, evolves from actual artifacts. This could be the smoking gun, it could be the bullet casing, it could be the blood on the doorknob, okay, in terms of crime. Here, there are objects used to prove some kind of point. And so we can use the objects perhaps of the old silver mines to prove the point of the arsenic and tungsten and mercury poisoning that's going on. This is pretty indisputable evidence. This is the hard stuff that we like to find that proves the fact, that is evidence of the fact that we're trying to go through and prove that way, not to be redundant. The second type of evidence of fact is a logical approach here. It's using anecdotes. And these are narratives that are parallel, that are analogous, or they illustrate or dramatize what it is that we're trying to talk about that way. Oh my goodness, I have neighbors moving in across the hall and they must have dropped an entire box. That's what you're hearing in the background. Okay, evidence of fact. So we have anecdotes and artifacts there with that one. Lastly, there are three of them, is statistics. And these are numbers, okay, that qualify or quantify rather a phenomenon or some kind of an event that's going on. And statistics are a screwy bunch of numbers because we can make them say what we want them to say at any given point. It was Samuel Clemens who said there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. And he was right in that respect. We can manipulate numbers to do whatever we want them to do. So some of the artifacts involved with the case was the different pathologies, the different medical artifacts, that the tests, the blood tests, the number of citizens who were infected that way, all kinds of information that was brought together as substantial, or what's called a preponderance of evidence within the class action case. And then there were the anecdotes, the stories of the people who lived in southern Utah. And these became probably the most mind-changing elements of this case, as both the jury and the judge heard these heartbreaking accounts of people getting cancer and trying to get treatment and having that fail. As I talked to the judge who heard the case, he broke down and wept in front of me as he talked about his relationship and understanding what happened to these people. And then the statistics that came about were plentiful, as you can imagine. Here we're seeing a map of the areas infected by the radioactive dust that fell from the sky from Dirty Harry. And you can see how far east that goes into Connecticut, even up into Maine. It was pretty amazing and pretty inarguable, at least, that there was something certainly ubiquitous about the spread of the radioactive stuff. The problem with that is the correlation could not be made to what was happening with cancer. So, okay, the other type of evidence is evidence of opinion. And the first type of evidence that way is expert testimony. Here's where we have content experts who become source-based evidence, okay? And these are people like geologists, nuclear physicists in the case of the Downwinders, hydrologists are what we need to go through and prove our evidence that it was the arsenic and mercury and tungsten in the water the instead of the fallout of what's going on. And these are individuals we have psychological, psychiatric, I guess is what I'm trying to say, experts. We have experts on all kinds of things that are out there. I am called in to testify because I understand how people lie. And as a result, I'm able to look at certain nonverbal tells and become an expert testifier in that respect. The other type of evidence of opinion is what's called witness testimony. And this is where there's a first-hand account. And how that first-hand witness, that eyewitness of what happened, relates to then the other evidence that's brought together to go through and put forth a case. Okay. The problem with witness testimony is it all goes through that individual's perspective, and all of our perspectives are different. We're all going to see the same thing different ways, and so that becomes somewhat problematic. Let's see. We talked about this is an expert testimony dealing with, if I recall, the above ground fallout effects there. The anecdotes that came from downwinders on the case. I keep forgetting that I have images that support what it is that I'm talking about here. Evidence has, and if you pardon the expression, a litmus test, meaning there's certain things that evidence needs to go through in order for us to really consider it. First and foremost is it's got to be accurate, okay? And we have to be able to identify any kind of bias that exists within the evidence. Is the evidence consistent across the board? So does my eyewitness agree with my content expert, or does that agree with the anecdotes or the actual artifacts that we're finding? If there's inconsistency, then the case becomes much harder to go through and prove that way. Does it have a fast shelf life? Is it current? Okay, it's tough to go through and build a case on evidence that is dated, that is old. Lots of cases, lots of cold cases that are out there exist because they weren't able to go through and make current ties, which brings me to relevance. Is the evidence relevant to the case? This gets into some argumentative fallacies, like an ad hoc fallacy that way. It all has to relate. The evidence has to relate directly to what it is that we're arguing. Is it representative of the case? Okay, in terms of context, do we have a social, cultural, and psychological representation of what the case is actually about? Is it qualified? How did we gather that evidence? Was it done through some type of way that might not agree with the laws that are created and how we gather evidence? Has it been contaminated? Has it been shared previously? Has it been swapped? What's going on? The evidence needs to be qualified. Is there enough evidence out there? And is it verifiable? Is it the truth? And that's what evidence is all about. Not only do we have that kind of hard evidence, but we also have what's called credibility, what we call the ethos of evidence. And this falls more to the attorney, to the representative, to you, the arguer, in terms of establishing your evidence. There are 3 C's to this idea of credibility. The first one being competency. Do you have the ability to articulate? Can you outline a case? Can you recognize argumentative fallacies? Can you enunciate? Is your vocabulary up to speed in putting out that kind of a case? And then there's charisma. This is something, for the most part, that we really can't teach. You've either got it or you don't have it. And we see the downside of charisma as well in terms of, say, Donald Trump, a very charismatic individual, but in terms of his competencies, there's very little credibility there. We don't have evidence of credibility with him as a result of that. Unfortunately, most of us are some kind of victim to charisma in that respect. The third C is confidence and how we're putting that case across. This class, unfortunately, really doesn't get into that a whole lot. While we're doing our first constructives as a video, you obviously can do that video as many times as you want until you're happy with how you were presented. When you're presenting a case to a live audience, though, that confidence has to be out there. And it has to be founded within the surety of the case that you're putting forward. So there you go, a little diatribe on evidence.